Well, welcome, everyone. I have a great guest today with a fabulous book. I highly recommend it. Our guest is Dr. Adam Gazzaley, and the book is called The Distracted Mind, Ancient Brains in a High-Tech World. Highly recommend it. You can get it on Amazon. And we're going to be talking about that book today and about some stuff that I know will relate to you. Before we get started, if you want to support our podcast, make sure to share and subscribe. So let's not waste any more time. Welcome to the professor. Actually, I forgot to even tell you, he's professor in the departments of Neurology, Physiology, and Psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco, where he's also the founding director of Neuroscape Lab. And we'll find out more about that too. So let's not waste any more time. Welcome to the show. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. A fascinating topic indeed, the distracted mind. What made you decide to write about this?
Well, the topic was really initiated by my research at University of California in San Francisco. So my work previously had been associated with aging and memory. And when I moved to California, I actually started at Berkeley on this topic and then moved to San Francisco. I was interested in how attention impacted memory. As we all know, and easily imagine if you don't know that a memory doesn't take place in a bubble, right? It's related to how well you're focusing or being distracted or moving between multiple tasks. And I was really interested in that for some practical reasons, my own challenge with multitasking and technology, and also my work on aging brought me in that direction as well, because as a neurologist, I saw patients with dementia, usually Alzheimer's disease, and I really focused on the earliest phases of that condition, when it was actually unclear whether this was healthy aging, where the mind tends to decline in its abilities as we get older, just like our hair changes colors, our bones change, the brain changes, or whether this was something more concerning like dementia. And what I found was that when you really ask older adults in both my clinical practice and my research about those senior moments, what I was hearing was not just memory problems, but attention problems. And so my research really focused on attention, and not just attention in isolation, but how attention influences our decision making and our perception and our memory, our short-term memory, our long-term memory. And so I studied that for many years using functional brain imaging to understand what happens in the brain when you are either being distracted or multitasking, and how that impairs your performance. And from that very basic research, which we published in peer-reviewed journals, I started to become interested in the larger story. Not every lab can study every facet of a problem. And I studied it in a very, artificial but powerful setting of the laboratory inside MRI scanners. But I was very interested in the real world translation of this topic. What does it mean to have your attention influence your memory, and to have distraction and multitasking impair those processes? And the natural direction that I went into was technology. How does the technology that has offered us so much also challenge these very basic abilities?
Fascinating. I can't wait to find out the answer. We can't give it all away. He's got to get the book, The Distracted Mind. But I wanted a couple questions that popped up in my head. Now, when you're looking at attention, I know there's certain areas of the brain that are focused on that area. I think it was the anterior cingulate cortex. Is that one of the areas you're looking at as well?
Yeah, the front part of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, is on the midline, but the prefrontal cortex is the most evolved part of the brain. And it really is the sort of the site, the focus of goal-directed attention. Some of our attention is mediated by the environment itself. So flash of, loud sound, flash of light, you pay attention independent of your goals. And then the other type of attention, the top-down attention, based upon a decision you reach and a goal you set, that's really the prefrontal cortex that contributes to those type of goals and that type of attention.
And I think there was another one called the reticular activating system. Is that another one is that also part of this, or no?
It is. Some of these areas are more associated with arousal. It's quite complex, obviously, and
Sure.
Again, nothing is in isolation. So being aroused and awake is part of attention. If you're not, your attention is declined, but they're separate. So the reticular activating system could be more on the arousal side, but you have the attention system, the awareness. All of this comes together to give you your perception of reality, how you interact with the world as a conscious being.
Interesting. My background showing, I guess, in the forensic world. So I was trying to see if I see any correlations here. Fascinating stuff. I guess my last neuroscience question, then we'll head over to talking about technology and how it influences. You said memory. Are you talking about, was it specifically the hippocampus? Was it the amygdala? Was it both?
Yeah, so the hippocampus is, considered the seat of memory and really long-term memory, that consolidated memory that stays with you for either an hour or for your whole life, remote memory. And the amygdala, located in the brain very close to the hippocampus, is more for emotion processing. It has strong ties. Obviously, emotion and memory are very close. Strongly powerful, emotionally evocative events are often remembered better than those that are not. So it's part of that larger system, but it's more on the emotion processing side. So that memory is impacted, that long-term memory impacted by challenges to attention. But there's another type of memory that we call working memory. It's related to short-term memory. And what it is, it's that memory that you just hold in your mind for very brief periods of time, just to do an operation. Like someone gives you a phone number, you hold it in your head, you get it into back in the day when we actually typed in phone numbers.
Oh, geez, yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't happen anymore, but it used to be a good example. And holding a number in mind like that is working memory. Yeah, almost certainly not going to remember it later, but it's the memory that you use just in those immediate operations. So you're having a conversation, someone says something to you, you have a reply, someone else interrupts, you're waiting, you're holding that. We're constantly have that online memory, and that is very vulnerable to distractions and interruptions in your thinking process.
Fascinating stuff. Fascinating. All right, now we're getting back to the technology. When you're talking about technology and the distracted mind, you talked about a couple of different concepts. One of them is, for a while, people said, "Oh, you can multitask. Can't you chew gum and do this?" Whatever it was used to be the slogan. What did you find out when it comes to multitasking?
Multitasking is a challenging topic because a lot of it is terminology and what different people mean when they say multitasking. So the act of multitasking as a behavior is something we do all the time. So you might say, I'm going to chew gum and walk, and maybe you'd consider that multitasking. Or you might say, I am going to have a phone call and put the clothes in the laundry, right? So that's an example of two tasks. Both of them are higher level than just walking and chewing gum, that we do at the same time all the time. We constantly perform and interact in the world in that way. And we can do that. So from that perspective, multitasking is something that we can and do quite frequently. The complexity is when people use the term multitasking to mean parallel processing, which is a term used in the computer world when you're thinking about the processors in a laptop, and can you send two tasks down parallel streams that are not going to impede one another and wind out completed in the same way, in the same sort of speed that is if you sent one. So no interference. And that type of multitasking is what our brain does not do very well at. So that's why a neuroscientist like myself might say multitasking is a myth. It's impossible, because when you have attention demanding tasks, so not chewing gum, let's say, although that may invoke some interference, but when you have attention demanding tasks, and the more attention they demand, the greater the interference, and you try to do them at the same time, they collide with each other and they diminish each other, the ability to perform them compared to doing one at a time. So take a high level task like having a conversation like we are, take another high level task like typing an email. You can't do those at the same time, right? So sometimes it's quite obvious. Like if you tried to do it, you'd be tripping over yourself. You'd have to constantly be asking, what were we talking about? And so when you raise the demands of the task, it becomes quite obvious. You don't need a lab to show that you can't actually do that. But when the tasks become more routine, then you can offload some of it just on automatic, repetitive processes. So it really depends what we're talking about in terms of multitasking. But just to conclude, when we're talking about two attention demanding tasks simultaneously, and that's a lot of what people mean by multitasking, then you cannot do them concurrently. You can't really engage in them at the same time without some cost in performance, usually on both of them.
Fascinating stuff. I can't wait to find out the media. It reminds me a little bit of, I was talking to a magician last year, Apollo Robbins, and he was talking about pickpocketing and how you distract one part with touching the body, and then you're taking something else away, and then misdirection, how you keep somebody focusing on one thing and not another. And there was a sleight of hand, I think it was. You ever heard of Kevin Mitnick? I think it was not Kevin Mitnick, not him. Oh, I forgot the guy's name. It's a married couple that did the book Sleight of Hand.
Oh, yes, I do know them. Yeah, the neuroscience background, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, there is a really fascinating perspective on neuroscience through magic. I actually did a podcast on stage with a magician. It was for a live audience, but became a podcast after that, where he would perform a magic trick, an illusion, a sleight of hand, and then I would sort of break down the neuroscience behind it. And there's many different types, and they're all essentially taking, sort of capitalizing on the limitations of the brain's function. That's what they are, and magicians are brilliant at discovering those even without a knowledge of how the brain works, and then using them to create really like mystifying illusions and tricks. And one of them is the one you described. Since we have a limited capacity to process information, we have to make decisions. That's what attention is, right? Goal-directed attention is making a decision and focusing your limited resources in space and in time, leaving open the opportunity that all the other information is not going to be processed. And it's what allows us to be effective in a world that has more information than we can manage, but it can be exploited in lots of ways. Magic is not the only way. Advertising is another example that has been sort of described as a way that attention can be manipulated to reach certain ends.
Oh, now you got me wondering about that. Let's head over to media multitasking. You mentioned things there. Are you referring here to like your cell phone? Obviously, we've heard about the cell phone studies and driving and things of that nature, but what are you referring to when you talk about media multitasking?
Yeah, that term is pretty inclusive of all digital media. So it may be, social media using your phone, emailing, video game play. So it's very broad, and there's a whole field devoted more by psychologists like behavioral psychologists, field psychologists. My co-author in The Distracted Mind, Larry Rosen, while I was work in the laboratory and do brain imaging, he works in the field studying real world interference and distraction and how media itself can degrade performance when you're trying to accomplish a goal. So that term media multitasking is very broad. It even includes things like television watching. It's essentially, how do you consume multiple sources of information through digital platforms, either alone or simultaneously?
Did you know, when you mentioned TV, did you notice anything at all in regards to what you're watching or playing with, like watching a music video or listening to the music video while you're doing homework, or watching a conversation like this, which is a little bit you have to really focus in on and listening to it? Anything like that? Or
I mean, it's similar to the conversation we were having before about how you might be able to put clothes in the laundry while having a conversation, but you're not able to write an email while you're having a conversation. It depends on how much attention is involved in the tasks, whether they create interference with one another and how much interference. So if you have the TV on in the background and you're passive about your consumption of it, then it's going to interfere less with a conversation you're having or work that you're doing. But if you are, watching a documentary and trying to learn something and really, following it all, then it's going to be an incredible source of interference on your homework. If you're, a 13-year-old watching something or playing a video game, which demands a lot of attention, and trying to do your homework at the same time. So, it just depends on how attention demanding those are. If they're both high, they're going to collide with each other.
Absolutely right. Let me ask you this. We'll get to in a minute. We're going to get to some of your strategies to help people. Again, folks, this is The Distracted Mind, Ancient Brains in a High-Tech World. Definitely go get that on Amazon.com. I highly recommend it. We're going to get to some of your strategies, which is interesting because you throw video games in there, so I can't wait to hear about that. I got a couple more questions, if you don't mind. One is, does child abuse or ACEs play a role at all? I don't know if you even saw that in regards to attention.
Yeah, it's such a big, complex topic, but the general thinking is that our attention abilities are very vulnerable to all sorts of challenges. So we're talking about the external challenges of the technology world, which are very clear to anyone that's ever tried to keep 6 browser tabs open and also do their email and respond to texts. I mean, we're overloaded and our attention is fragmented by that, but it can also be challenged internally as well. So childhood trauma that produces things like PTSD, and it doesn't have to be childhood, and depression, anxiety, stress, sleep deprivation, all of these things, intoxication, pretty much anything can alter and impair attention abilities. Drowsiness, but just being overtired is a large source of vehicular accidents, because you need that high level of attention when you do, right? Most of the time you might not, but when you do, you need it there. And so attention is, to me, it's been a fascinating topic that I've worked on for the last 15 years, because you can see that it is so vulnerable to so many different factors. I would go so far as to say that anything that affects the brain in a detrimental way, any neurological, psychiatric condition you could think of, from depression, autism, schizophrenia, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, if you affect the functioning of the brain, almost an invariable consequence is challenges with attention abilities. And so you see that right across the gamut of conditions. And then when attention is affected, it cascades to effects on pretty much everything else. So when your attention is impaired, your work is impaired. Your safety may be impaired if you're driving a car. Your relationships may be impaired if you can't engage with your partner in a deep way and really focus. So that's the beauty of attention, is that it is vulnerable and it impacts so many things. So keeping high attention ability is really critical for quality of life.
Man, but fabulous. You wiped out most of my questions now. Got one left, and then we'll go into prevention strategies. Sure. You hear this line, I always wonder whether it was true or not. I'm still trying to find the origin of it. We process about 40 bits of information consciously, but we process 1 million bits of information unconsciously. I'm not sure how they even quantify it. What's your take on that, out of curiosity?
Yeah, well, it's related to a topic that we just talked about a little earlier, is that we're surrounded by obviously almost an infinite amount of information across, that could enter our brains through, numerous senses. Even within the tactile system, we have pain receptors and vibration receptors and movement across your hairs. And so we have the receptor systems and the sensory systems to take in a tremendous amount of information, and that information is abundant. But if we are going to interact with the world in a goal-directed way, we need to make decisions about what we want to process, right? Like what we're doing right now, what your listeners are hopefully doing, is they're listening, right? They're making a decision to listen. You're making a decision to look at something, and that comes at a cost of filtering other things around you. But that information is still getting in to some degree. So the narrow focus of your information is what you have to work with at any given moment. But there's other things that are coming in that you may not be consciously processing, but are potentially influencing your behavior in subconscious ways. So your stomach may be grumbling. You may not be aware of it, but it may be making you grumpier because you're hungry, you haven't had lunch yet. Likewise, there may be noise in the environment around you. Maybe you're having this conversation in a coffee shop, like we used to pre-COVID, and you're encumbered by information that's irrelevant to you, but it's preventing you from focusing on what you're hearing. And so, yes, both of those things that you said are true. I mean, quantifying them is really, really very difficult, but we have a small sliver of goal-directed focused attention that we can direct. And then a lot of everything else is suppressed around it, but some of it invariably comes through and creates interference in your goals and accomplishing what your goals are.
Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. Now, you come up with some prevention strategies, including video games. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So when I think about how do you manage technology and essentially anything that is going to compete with your goals, right? So you have a goal, you want to accomplish something, and it could be a little mini goal like writing an email or finishing lunch. It could be a long goal like going to graduate school. Goals come in many different varieties, many different time courses. There's going to be sources of interference everywhere that prevents you from accomplishing that. And one of the ways that I think about it is, given what we had just talked about, that if you want to really have high level performance and you're doing something that is attention demanding and you engage in something else that's attention demanding, you're going to degrade it. What I suggest is that you start by being introspective and you realize that you can't do this effectively. You can't fragment your attention and be as effective as you would as if you single task, as if you kept the sole focus of attention. So what I suggest, and I only suggest it because I do it myself, is that when I have something that's important, that demands quality, I single task. So that might involve quitting, all other applications, shutting down a browser, even putting my phone on airplane mode if I really want to lock in, and then focus on that one thing. And that's how you'll get the highest quality. Now, anyone listening to this might think, oh, okay, I get that, I could do that. What you would find is that it's actually really hard to do, especially if you're not in the practice of doing it. It's sort of like going out like, oh, I'm gonna, run a marathon in 6 months, so I'm gonna go out and run 3 miles today. When you don't run, you can't do that, right? So you have limitations, you have to work up to it. So if you sat down and tried to single task right now for 2 hours, you would probably fail. You might find that you're anxious. You might find that you feel like you're missing out on other things. You might feel anxious because you're not being maximally productive, that if you're doing more things simultaneously, you would. You might get bored. And these things are what deter people from engaging in a single task. And so the way that you get better at it is to baby step into it, sort of like training for a marathon. Give yourself, 20 minutes to do one thing, take a break, and then try 20 minutes again. And I think that, and what I found in my own experience, that as you do that, your capacity to go for a longer period of time without switching over to something else because you're anxious or bored becomes longer, and your capacity becomes greater, the times become longer. So that's usually how I think about improving your ability to interact with technology, is decide when you want to single task, when it's something important. The flip side of that is sometimes you're doing a lot of low level things that you should multitask. Like it's fine, it's fine to listen to music and work on a project that has months until you finish, and and it's fun to multitask. So I don't like saying like something is good and something is bad. The world is much grayer than that. It's more nuanced, and there are things that are going to be fine to multitask and other things that you're going to really want your attention focused. So when you make that decision, I block it in my calendar. I say I am going to really just do this one thing as if it was a Zoom call, even though it's not. It's just, I'm going to work on this article right now. And then I give myself an hour and maybe break it into 20-minute segments and take a break along the way. The important consideration here is that those breaks are not all created equal, right? So an appropriate break, I feel, is, having a quiet moment of meditation, maybe taking a short walk, looking at nature, um, not going on email, social media, things like that demand a lot of attention themselves. You want a low attention activity. And also, they become like these sinkholes that take you further and further away from getting back to your original goal. So that's how I go about it, and it's practice, and it takes months to get good at it. But the outcome is that you find that single tasking is actually fun, and not so painful. Sort of the same way, going back to the running analogy, that it was really painful to run even a half a mile, but once you get trained and once you get over the hurdle, you find that you could run 3 miles and it's exhilarating and it actually feels good. And I think it's the same thing with single tasking.
Great stuff. Does that also sound like meditation was thrown in there too?
Yeah, I think meditation is something that is, it's not, it doesn't work for everyone, but if you have a good tutor or a way of being introduced to it and take the time to practice it, and slow down, have a singular focus like breath, it could be a real, another great way of taking a break when you're overloaded with all your tasks and just trying to focus on one thing.
Fabulous stuff, folks. Again, the book called The Distracted Mind by Dr. Gazzaley, Gazzaley, The Distracted Mind, Ancient Brains in a High-Tech World. Thank you so much, Professor, for being here.
My pleasure. It was really fun talking with you today.
Likewise, sir. A lot of fun. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Remember, if you want to support our podcast, share and subscribe.